Looking up to heaven, Jesus said, Ephatha, that is, be opened. Amen. How can we open ourselves to God? When we go beyond the way others experience us, beyond who we think we are, we will encounter God. Today I'm going to provide two pictures of this openness. The first comes from Mark's story of the Syrophoenician mother, and the second comes from the ancient Book of Proverbs. Now, a couple of weeks ago, my wife and I were driving our 23-year-old Toyota minivan after getting smog checked, and we're going down the peninsula, only a short distance from where 19th Avenue hits 280. So we're going about 70 miles per hour, and all of a sudden, there's broken glass all over the inside of the car, and I couldn't see out or anything, and I didn't know what was going on. And Heidi has immediately laid into the horn and was looking underneath the hood, around the edge of the hood, and pulling us into the fast lane, into the very center divider. And I just didn't know what was happening or what was going on. But the hood had unlatched and gone through the front windshield. And she drove us over to that center median. And I started looking over my shoulder, and the cars are going past. They're going like 80 miles per hour. Vroom, 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 vroom. And I turn around, and Heidi's already gotten out of the car. She's standing on the center median, and she's trying to close the hood. Flonk, flonk, flonk. And I see these little hands reach in, grab the windshield wipers, move the windshield wipers out, and flonk, and the whole thing closed. And even then, I didn't know what to do, but before I knew it, she'd shifted the car into gear, and she was moving us safely across, and it was not easy. Safely across from that fast lane lane, all the way to the off-ramp, and then taking surface streets to the car repair shop. Now, Jesus and the Book of Proverbs, they teach us that faith is not a matter of believing. Instead, it's something like that kind of wisdom, that kind of intelligence, that courage, that boldness, that willingness to face risks. That is what Heidi exemplifies so clearly in that car afternoon, in that accident. Now, I don't know how many of you have read this. Maybe you have. Did any of you read the article about the Taliban in the newspaper this week? Raise your hand if you did. I'm just going to read the first few lines from it so you can get the gist of it. It goes like this: no education beyond the 6th grade, no employment in most workplaces, and no access to public spaces like parks, gyms, and salons. No long-distance travel if unaccompanied by a male relative. No leaving home if not covered from head to toe. And now, the sound of a woman's voice outside the home has been outlawed in Afghanistan, according to a 114-page manifesto released last month. Now, I don't want to put too fine a point on it, but if Heidi and I had been living in Afghanistan, I would have been dead because I would have been killed by my slow reaction to that unfolding disaster. Not only that, but much of what we understand about the meaning and richness of Jesus' message comes from his interaction with women that would not have been tolerated under Taliban prohibitions. Now, I have in mind, I hope you have a chance to look at the stained glass window right through here. You just look at the north aisle. You can't see it from where you're sitting, but after church, have a look at that. That's a picture of Jesus with the Samaritan woman by the well. I also think of Mary Magdalene, who's in the window right there. She was one of Jesus' closest friends. And I think of Susanna and Joanna, all the women who cared for the disciples out of their resources. If we didn't know about the deep love that Jesus had for Martha and Mary, and a different kind of people, but a same kind of love, we would be impoverished. We would not really understand what Jesus' message was. Jesus broke down the walls in a patriarchal and xenophobic society. And this continues to change the way we interact with each other in our society today. It's an ongoing effect that will continue through the generations long after we're gone. So what Jesus does is he always expands the circle of belonging. And this is the Gospel of Mark's theme, beginning with the sick, the ignored, the poor, widows and orphans, people who are possessed by demons or ritually impure like lepers or women suffering from a flow of blood, adherents of other religions, or even to the ultimate oppressor, an imperial centurion who is the first one to recognize at the crucifixion and say, truly, Jesus, this man was God's son. All of this shows the way that the knowledge and healing of God continues to radiate outward. And we are part of that, us, you and I, in the way we interact with people in our daily lives. So in Mark chapters 5 and 6, they take place primarily in Jewish territory, but it is the nature of the healing, freeing, saving work of God that it constantly expands from that Jewish center to include all people without exception. And the place where this happens matters so much. In chapter 7, it is translated as, quote, the region of Tyre. But in fact, the word region is one of the most frequently used readings in this. One of the words, if you go home and circle all the time, the word region occurs in the gospel that you read today. It's many. And the word in Greek is different than region. It's not a very good translation. The Greek word is horia, and it means border, coast, domain, limit. So horia is related to our word horizon. So Jesus is on the horizon, on the very edge, and the story begins with him there at the edge, seeking rest and solitude in a house. But Mark writes this: Jesus could not escape notice. And isn't that true today also? Jesus cannot be hidden, and wherever you go, whatever you're doing, someone will see Jesus in what you do and how you are. So this is an extraordinary thing. I think as a child we just lost sight of it. But imagine, without being invited, as an utter stranger, and even as an enemy, this Syrophoenician woman enters the house. And although Mark uses the most spare, pared down language in the Bible, he uses 3 different words to describe her identity. She lives in the region, that is the borderlands, the Horia of Tyre. She is Hellenis, that is the Greek word for Greek, like Hellenic. That means she's part of the Greek religious, cultural, and political empire. And then she is of the Syrophoenician race, a race of people that were constantly at war with the Hebrews in the Old Testament. A few decades after Jesus' birth, the Jewish historian Josephus described her people, the Syrophoenicians, as, quote, our bitterest enemies. And Jews working in the countryside of that region would sometimes starve to death while the city warehouses that they filled with their produce were overflowing. And so in those days, they called the Syrophoenician taskmasters dogs. And when this woman asked Jesus to save her demon-afflicted daughter, he seems to be making reference to this in his reply. Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the little dogs. Now, he seems to be reminding her about the relations between their two people, people who have been oppressed and people who are the oppressors. He seems to be reminding her how much his own nation is suffering and how badly they need his blessing. But then, this brave and extraordinary woman says, Sir, Curia, Lord, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. And in an instant, she brilliantly refers to the nature of his mission, to Jesus' message that when it comes to God, there is enough for everyone. No one needs to be left out. Who we look like on the outside is immaterial, and Jesus recognizes the truth that she states, and he heals her daughter. Now, I think it's so natural to be curious about the Jesus of this story, to have questions about this Jesus. On the one hand, you might wonder if Jesus speaks about the children's food lightly, with affection, or a sparkle in his eye, a gentle sense of satire. Or is he so tired and sensitive to his people's mistreatment that he speaks bluntly, maybe even harshly to her, and then genuinely and humbly recognizes his error. Now, I've studied this so carefully for 30 years and read scores of commentaries, and I'm going to tell you this: we're never going to answer that question. We're never going to get to the bottom of that one. But the point of the story really lies elsewhere. Here, the faith that Jesus admires is not about believing in something, a creed or a doctrine or an abstract idea about God or a religious authority. The faith that the woman exemplifies is boldness, the incredible courage to reach out beyond the substantial boundaries of human identity. Now, this is the faith that recognizes our own need and reaches out to God insistently for help. Now, you might wonder why we don't always do this. I mean, there's definitely a part of us that is about our nature. It's Heidi's nature to, like when she's in a car accident, to rise to the top of her game and to command the situation. But I think some of it is because of our own sense of fear, and our fear, especially of not being in control. It is so hard to break social taboos, to do anything about the walls of our identity which contain us and wall other people out from us. This difficulty, the difficulty of not being open to God, also comes from our spiritual deafness. We have so many distractions. We're playing so many different stories in our heads that we're never really quite quiet. And as a result, we cannot hear the truth about our situation or recognize the way that we depend on everything for God. So what does being opened look like? You see this openness in many of the people in this room. Some of the most extraordinary people I've ever encountered are right here, gathered together, and will never be quite the same group ever again. The people here, so many of us are dedicated to a life of prayer. And that sense of prayer, you see it in their lives. You recognize it when you're with them. You can also see it in the ancient book of Proverbs. Now, I want to talk about that book of Proverbs because I never do it. There are three kinds of literature in the Old Testament. There's the Torah, the law. There's the Nevi'im, which is the book of the prophets, like Amos and Isaiah and Jeremiah. And then there's the wisdom literature, the Ketuvim. And this is the literature that includes Job and the Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. So the book of Proverbs is in that category, and it's attributed to King Solomon. King Solomon was the wise king. He was offered to have anything he wanted in the world. He didn't choose great wealth. He didn't choose a long life. He didn't choose retribution on his enemies. He chose wisdom. And so this is a book of wisdom. The Hebrew word for wisdom is chokhmah, and it means more than just like a list of things, facts in your head. It's more than just a mental state. It's a kind of skill or action for living well in God's cosmos. So chapters 1 through 9 include 10 speeches from a father to a son about living with virtue and integrity. But the majority of the book is dedicated to hundreds of ancient proverbs. And these are about family and marriage and sex and friendship and neighbors and money and anger and alcohol and debt. They're the same things we're talking about today. And many of them are from ancient collections of proverbs that came from the Egyptians. Some of them are more than 3,000 years old. And yet, many of them are still applicable today. The Taliban's prohibition of public speech reminded me that in the book of Proverbs, wisdom is personified as a woman, and she's preaching in the public marketplace, and she's talking about the way that goodness is woven into the fabric of the universe. So wisdom, that lady wisdom, teaches that when we act with integrity, we are going along with the grain of the universe. Now, the book of Proverbs ends with a king writing about the wisdom he learned from his mother, including an acrostic poem. Do you know what an acrostic poem is? It was an alphabet poem. So the first line begins with A, next letter with B, next letter C. It's wonderful in Hebrew, but it has a line that goes like this. The woman who embraces wisdom, she opens her mouth with wisdom, and the teaching of kindness is on her tongue. Sounds a lot like Heidi, too. So how could I summarize what Proverbs teaches? For me, the point of it goes far beyond the gender roles that are hard for us to see past in it. Proverbs begins by stating simply, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. And this doesn't mean that we should live as if God is going to harm us or live in a kind of terror of the God who Jesus describes as a loving parent toward us. Instead, it does mean revering God and recognizing our own role in the world. It is hard for us to realize that we are not God. We cannot simply make up our own definitions of good and evil. We need the wisdom and humility to realize that we are not the center of everything and to act out of that wisdom. Now, it's hard to explain, but the world of Proverbs is more about probabilities than promises. It says that if you act with integrity, as an honest and generous person, if you love justice, help others, etc., you are more likely to have a good life. But it also, we recognize there are no guarantees. Bad things happen to good people. We see that in other examples of wisdom literature, like in the book of Job or the book of Ecclesiastes. Now, I don't have very much more time with you, and I'm so sad about it, but I want to share just like 3 Proverbs with you, and then we'll go and have a great big party here at the altar and then out on the plaza. So here's a proverb. The purposes in the mind are like deep water, but the intelligent will draw them out. Better is a dinner of vegetables where love is than a fatted ox with hatred in it. Better to meet a she-bear robbed of its cubs than to confront a fool immersed in folly. What is desirable in a person is loyalty, and it is better to be poor than a liar. Now, outside this vast cathedral, you might sometimes feel like you're driving down the freeway with your hood up and your windshield glass shattered all over your lap. But today, on Congregation Sunday, God is giving us so many examples of faith, of love that is bold and determined and wise. How can we open ourselves to God? When we go beyond who we think we are, beyond the border of how others experience us, beyond our sense that we are the center. And when we do this, we encounter Jesus' God of love.